At 12:07 in the morning, Darius Whitmore found his mother standing barefoot beneath a porch light, clutching one suitcase while rain soaked through her nightgown. His wife Simone had changed the locks, canceled Loretta's phone, and warned the neighbors not to help her. Darius said nothing when Simone called the house hers alone and reminded him that the mortgage carried only her name. He wrapped his coat around his mother and drove away without another word. 48 hours later, Simone marched into Meridian Crown Bank to demand control of her loan, then stopped breathing when the new chairman walked in, kissed Loretta's forehead, and took the seat across from her. Stay until the final reckoning, because Simone's cruelest secret would cost her far more than the house she worshipped above everything else. Darius and Simone lived in a lavish estate worth nearly $3,800,000 in the gated community of Bellwether Heights. On paper, Simone was listed as the primary buyer because she wanted her colleagues to believe she alone had built the glittering life they saw. In truth, Darius had covered the down payment through their joint account without ever asking for credit, since he had always treated the marriage as a partnership rather than a competition. He had once been one of the youngest bank restructuring specialists in Chicago, though Simone believed his firm was little more than a modest advisory office, and she had never cared enough to ask further. That gap between what she assumed and what was true would eventually become the crack the entire marriage fell through. Simone had climbed her own way, up through Ashbourne Properties, starting as a junior coordinator and clawing her way to head of development through long nights and careful alliances, and she genuinely believed the house was proof that her climb had been worth every sacrifice. She measured her own worth by square footage, by the brand of the cars in the driveway, and by the way people's eyes widened when they learned her address. And she assumed Darius measured himself the same way, even though he never once did. For now, though, the cracks were smaller, quieter, and easy to explain away over dinner. Loretta Whitmore, 70 years old, and a former head nurse, had to leave her rented apartment when the building's electrical system was condemned for repairs. So Darius invited his mother to stay in the guest room for what he assumed would be 6 short weeks. From the very first day, Simone made her discomfort impossible to ignore. She insisted Loretta stay out of the main living room, eat her meals in the smaller kitchen near the laundry room, and never invite old friends over, no matter how briefly. She complained that Loretta's aging sedan parked in the driveway lowered the image of the house, as though a car alone could undo years of careful staging. Loretta, unwilling to create friction inside her son's marriage, cooked quietly, tended the garden, and disappeared into her room whenever Simone entertained coworkers. She never once raised her voice, even when the silence around her grew heavier by the week. Darius began noticing the shift in his wife ever since Malcolm Vance, the polished vice president at Ashbourne Properties, had dangled the promise of a promotion in front of her. Simone stopped talking about family and started talking only about power, money, and the kind of people she believed deserved to stand beside her. One evening at dinner, she said flatly that Loretta needed to find somewhere else to live because the house, in her words, was not a retirement home. Darius pushed back immediately, reminding her that his mother was only staying temporarily and had once spent her entire savings helping the two of them survive the hardest years of their marriage. Simone answered coldly that Loretta had helped him, not her, and that she owed the woman nothing at all. Loretta heard every word from the hallway and pretended, as she always did, that she had heard nothing. That same week, Darius received an urgent call from Celeste Avery, his longtime financial attorney, about a deal he had been avoiding for months. Meridian Crown Bank was on the verge of being swallowed and dismantled by a larger financial conglomerate, and Celeste needed him at a closed-door meeting 2 states away within 48 hours. Before he left, Darius asked Simone directly not to make things difficult for his mother while he was gone. Simone smiled and promised she would treat Loretta exactly the way she deserved to be treated, a sentence Darius mistook for reassurance instead of warning. The moment his car cleared the front gate, Simone locked the door to the home office, picked up her phone, and called a locksmith, demanding the crew arrive before midnight. She had already decided what kind of night this was going to be, long before her husband had even reached the highway. That evening, Simone hosted a private gathering for Malcolm Vance and 2 investors from Ashbourne Properties, and she ordered Loretta to remain upstairs out of sight of the guests. When Loretta came down briefly to retrieve her blood pressure medication, Malcolm glanced at her and asked without hesitation whether she was the new housekeeper. Before Loretta could answer for herself, Simone cut in and said the older woman was simply a relative staying temporarily and that she would be gone by morning. Loretta absorbed the insult in silence, though later, once the guests had left, she quietly asked her daughter-in-law why she was so ashamed to introduce her as family. Simone erupted, instead of answering, accusing Loretta of ruining her chances at a promotion, cheapening the house, and making Malcolm assume she was financially responsible for her husband's entire family. Loretta, refusing to escalate further, said she would simply call Darius and leave in the morning on her own terms. Simone did not wait for morning. She grabbed Loretta's phone, canceled the secondary line the family had been paying for years, and tossed the device onto the couch as though it meant nothing. Despite the cold rain falling outside, she dragged Loretta's suitcase to the front porch and ordered the locksmith to begin changing the locks while the older woman still stood inside the house. Loretta was only able to gather a few things in the chaos: one suitcase of clothing, her blood pressure medicine, a photo album of family memories, and her late husband's old wristwatch. Simone shoved the suitcase through the door and told her plainly that this was her house now, and that she did not need permission from anyone's son to decide who stayed inside it. At 12:07 that morning, the door closed behind her, and the sound of the new lock clicking into place echoed louder than either of them expected. Loretta had no car of her own to escape in, because Simone had already instructed the property's security guard to tow it to a lot outside the neighborhood entirely. Loretta stood barefoot under the porch light, since her slippers were still upstairs in the guest room she no longer had access to. A neighbor stepped forward to help, but Simone had already told the security guard that the older woman was causing a disturbance and should not be allowed back onto the property. More than an hour away, Darius checked his phone during a break in his meeting and found 3 missed calls from a number he did not immediately recognize as his neighbor's. He left the meeting without explanation and drove straight through the rain, arriving to find his mother soaked to the skin, still clutching her suitcase beneath the porch light. He did not shout, did not pound on the door, and did not threaten anyone standing nearby. He simply removed his own coat, wrapped it around his mother's shoulders, and guided her gently toward the car. Simone opened an upstairs window and called down that Loretta was no longer welcome in the house under any circumstances. Darius looked up and asked calmly whether she truly understood what she was choosing to do at that moment. Simone answered that the house was in her name, the mortgage was in her name, and there was nothing he could do to change either fact. Darius nodded slowly, told her that from now on, everything between them would be handled strictly, according to the paperwork, and helped his mother into the passenger seat without another word of argument. Once the car was moving, he called Celeste and told her he was ready to finally accept the Meridian Crown deal, adding one more request that would change everything neither woman inside that house could yet imagine. He asked her to check exactly which properties the bank currently held mortgages on, starting with a specific address in Bellwether Heights. Darius checked his mother into the best long-term suite at a boutique hotel run by an old family friend, though Loretta insisted she felt guilty for supposedly causing trouble in her son's marriage. Darius told her firmly that she had not broken anything. She had simply forced him to finally see what had already been broken for a long time. Long before this marriage, Darius had been one of the youngest bank restructuring specialists in Chicago, known for rescuing struggling financial institutions without resorting to mass layoffs. After his father's death, he stepped away from public leadership entirely and quietly founded Whitmore Capital Holdings, letting Celeste and a small, trusted team represent him in most major dealings. Simone had always known he worked in finance, but she believed his firm was a modest advisory practice, and she had never once asked deeper questions about the scope of his work. That single gap in her curiosity had allowed her to build an entire identity around a man she had never truly bothered to understand. Meridian Crown Bank was drowning in bad debt after its former leadership approved a wave of poorly secured real estate loans, and a rival conglomerate wanted to buy the bank, close 18 branches, and eliminate nearly 600 jobs. Darius had studied this deal for months, but kept delaying it, unwilling to step back into the kind of public power that had once consumed his father's final years. What happened to his mother did not create this decision out of nothing, but it did strip away the last excuse he had for hiding from responsibility. He told Celeste plainly that walking away from power had never actually protected the people he loved. It had only left them exposed while he stayed comfortable. Celeste confirmed that Whitmore Capital could secure 62% of the voting shares if the deal closed before markets opened after the coming weekend. Darius agreed without hesitation, understanding for the first time in years exactly why he needed to walk back through that door. When the legal team reviewed the bank's loan portfolio ahead of the acquisition, they discovered something none of them expected to find. Meridian Crown was holding the mortgage on the Bellwether Heights estate, along with a personal line of credit worth $1,600,000 that Simone had personally guaranteed. Buried further in, they found several development loans tied to Ashbourne properties, and one additional hidden loan quietly funneled through a shell company controlled by Malcolm Vance. Darius immediately instructed Celeste that nothing about Simone's mortgage was to be touched outside the bounds of the law, no matter how tempting it might be to use his new position against her. He made his intention clear in a single sentence that Celeste would repeat to the board more than once in the days ahead. He said he had not bought a bank to take a woman's house, he had bought it to protect it from the people quietly stealing from the inside. The next morning, Simone woke up convinced Darius would eventually return home to apologize for storming off in anger. She shared images of the mansion with friends, hinting that sometimes a person had to remove negative energy from their life to protect their peace of mind. Malcolm called to congratulate her on reclaiming full control of her house, then casually asked her to sign an additional set of collateral adjustment documents for the Ashbourne Harbor project. Believing a promotion was finally within reach, Simone signed everything without reading a single page closely. Meanwhile, back at Whitmore Capital, Celeste placed a stack of loan documents in front of Darius and pointed to one digital signature buried deep inside the paperwork. It was his own signature used to guarantee a loan he had never seen, never approved, and never even known existed until that exact moment. Darius's legal team traced the digital signature back through months of document history and discovered that Simone had copied it directly from a joint tax filing the couple had signed together years earlier. She had used that copied signature on a mortgage addendum, quietly placing part of Darius's private investment portfolio at risk as additional collateral. Simone herself never received the funds directly, since the credit line had been routed to a real estate development firm that Malcolm described as an Ashbourne partner. In reality, that firm belonged entirely to Malcolm, hidden behind two representatives who existed only on paper. Darius had more than enough grounds to call the police immediately, but he wanted to understand first whether his wife was a willing accomplice or simply a pawn caught inside someone else's scheme. Celeste warned him that once the acquisition closed, any personal action he took regarding Simone's loan could be viewed as a serious conflict of interest. To protect the integrity of the process, Darius immediately withdrew from the committee reviewing Simone's loan directly, and he transferred the entire file to an independent audit division instead. He requested that every email and every access log connected to the account be preserved without exception, and he assigned an independent board member to oversee the matter from that point forward. This ensured that whatever consequences eventually followed would be seen as lawful and fair, rather than a husband's personal revenge dressed up as corporate policy. Loretta, still recovering at the hotel, finally admitted something she had been carrying quietly for weeks. She had overheard Simone speaking with Malcolm about refinancing the house to pull out additional equity for one of his investment projects, and she had gently warned Simone against gambling away the family home. That warning, Loretta now realized, was the true reason Simone had wanted her gone that night, far more than any embarrassment over appearances. Loretta also revealed that she had seen Malcolm quietly searching through papers in Darius's home office on the night of the party, though she had said nothing at the time, out of fear that Darius would think she was trying to sabotage his marriage. Darius felt a quiet ache hearing this understanding now that his mother had stayed silent to protect the very woman who had thrown her out into the cold. Within days after an intense overnight negotiation, Whitmore Capital finalized its acquisition of Meridian Crown Bank under strict conditions. The bank would not close any branch currently operating successfully, would not lay off frontline employees for at least 2 years, and would inject fresh capital to protect every depositor's savings. Wendell Cross, the outgoing chairman, agreed to remain through the transition period, even after stepping down from his role. Darius became the new executive chairman of Meridian Crown Bank, though the announcement had not yet been made public. Simone received a formal notice asking her to appear at the bank to verify certain changes related to her mortgage account, and she assumed it was nothing more than a clerical formality. Malcolm, uncharacteristically anxious, told her not to hand over her phone or laptop to any auditor under any circumstances, though he refused to explain exactly why. Simone chose to trust him rather than question the strange urgency in his voice, a decision she would come to regret within hours. As she prepared to leave for the bank, a single message arrived on her phone, from Darius, brief and impossible to misread. It told her that his mother was safe now, that she should not attempt to contact her, and that the two of them would finally speak somewhere. Every signature actually meant something. Simone read the message twice before setting the phone down, unaware of exactly how literal that sentence was about to become. Simone walked into the headquarters of Meridian Crown Bank with the same confidence she carried into every room she believed she controlled. She demanded to speak with the highest-ranking officer available and reminded the staff more than once that she was a priority client. Nadine Brooks, the branch manager overseeing her account, escorted her upstairs to a conference room on the top floor, without offering much explanation. Inside, Simone found Celeste Avery already seated, along with two independent auditors, Wendell Cross and a bank attorney, arranged around a long table. At the head of that table sat a single empty chair, and Simone felt her confidence falter the instant she saw who else was missing from the room. She assumed Darius was using his lawyer to pressure her during their separation, never imagining the meeting had nothing to do with their marriage at all. The door opened, and Darius walked in wearing a simple dark suit, his eyes moving past Simone entirely as he crossed the room. He went first to his mother, who had been quietly escorted in as a witness, kissed her forehead gently, and pulled out her chair before taking his own seat. Only then did he lower himself into the empty chair at the head of the table, and Wendell rose to make the introduction everyone in the room had been waiting for. He announced Darius Whitmore as the new executive chairman and controlling shareholder of Meridian Crown Bank, and the words landed on Simone like a physical blow. She asked, almost breathless, exactly how many shares he now controlled, and Darius answered that he controlled enough to ensure the bank would no longer finance lies. Simone immediately accused him of buying the bank purely to seize her house and humiliate her in front of strangers. Darius placed a folder documenting his own conflict of interest recusal on the table, proving he had withdrawn from every decision touching her loan the moment the risk was identified. Celeste explained calmly that the mortgage itself would continue exactly as agreed and that no one could seize the house as long as Simone continued making her payments on schedule. She added that the documents bearing a forged signature would be investigated regardless, and that the credit line connected to Malcolm had already been suspended from further disbursement. Darius did not threaten to take the house from her at all, and instead asked a single direct question that silenced the entire room. He asked whether she had known Malcolm was using his signature or whether she had actively helped him do it. Simone avoided the question, entirely insisting instead that she had only done what was necessary to protect her future, and that Darius had never made her feel secure enough to trust him with it. Loretta, calm and unshaken, asked her daughter-in-law, a question of her own wondering aloud, whether throwing a 70-year-old woman into the rain at midnight was truly part of protecting anyone's future. Simone offered no apology, insisting instead that Loretta had interfered in her marriage from the very beginning. The auditors then revealed that Malcolm's loan had already missed its collateral obligation and that his company would default entirely within 10 days unless additional funds were secured. Simone's stomach dropped as she realized her own house had been quietly added as secondary collateral through documents she had signed only 3 weeks earlier. Malcolm had never told her any of this, and the silence in the room made it clear that he never intended to. Simone stormed into the hallway and called Malcolm immediately, but his line had already gone dead. Moments later, a bank employee approached to inform her that Malcolm had just attempted to transfer $4,200,000 out of the country. Simone stood frozen in the hallway phone, still pressed to her ear, finally understanding that the man she had trusted more than her own husband had already decided she was expendable. Simone returned to the mansion in a state of quiet panic, and for the first time, the house no longer felt like a symbol of anything she had won. The chandelier she had once picked out to impress dinner guests now hung over an empty table, and the marble floor she had insisted on installing suddenly felt cold beneath her bare feet in a way it never had before. Every room seemed to remind her of something she had traded away in exchange for a promise that had already begun collapsing. She passed the living room, where she had once called Loretta a distant relative, staying temporarily the kitchen, where Loretta used to leave dinner waiting for her, and the hallway where a suitcase had once been dragged toward a door. She tried calling Malcolm repeatedly, but the calls went unanswered every single time. When she went to his office at Ashbourne Properties, she found it completely emptied with legal staff already seizing his computer and files. The company's president informed her that Malcolm had been suspended over suspected misappropriation of project funds, and that Simone herself was suspended as well, since her signature appeared on so many of the compromised documents. Simone found Darius at the hotel where Loretta was staying, though he agreed to meet her only in the lobby, refusing to let her anywhere near his mother's room. She swore she had not known Malcolm was forging documents, admitting only that she had allowed him access to Darius's home office to review financial reports for a refinancing plan. Darius asked why she had never simply asked his permission before allowing a stranger into his private files. Simone admitted she was afraid he would block an opportunity that finally promised her real wealth of her own. Darius answered coldly that she lived in a house worth nearly $4 million, yet still believed herself poor because not enough people envied her hard enough. When she tried shifting blame onto Loretta, claiming his mother had always made her feel unworthy within the family, Darius refused to accept it. He reminded her instead of everything his mother had actually done across the years of their marriage. Loretta had given Simone her own late mother's necklace on their wedding day, had helped cover rent during their earliest and hardest months together, had nursed Simone through recovery after a surgery, and had refused every offer of repayment. Once Darius finally succeeded. Darius told her plainly that her cruelty had never been a single moment of anger. It had been a choice she made again and again. When Simone begged him to use his authority at the bank to erase her name from the fraudulent documents and save the house, he refused outright. Protecting her from the legal consequences of her own actions, he explained, would make him exactly the kind of man he was trying to remove from power in the first place. Simone accused him bitterly of buying an entire bank, yet refusing to save his own wife. And Darius answered that he could save her from a loan, but not from the person she had chosen to become. That evening, Celeste called to report that Malcolm had been arrested at the airport before he could board his flight. Inside his luggage, investigators found a hard drive containing hundreds of emails, including a long thread of private messages exchanged between him and Simone. The recovered emails showed that Simone had known, at least in part, that Malcolm intended to use the house as collateral for his project long before the fraud came to light. She had not understood the full scale of what he was doing, but she had understood enough to know she was hiding something from her own husband. Worse, an email sent just 3 days before the night Loretta was thrown out contained a single damning line, stating plainly that Darius's mother had seen the paperwork and needed to leave the house before Darius returned home. Simone had told Malcolm that if Loretta stayed any longer, she might warn Darius about the documents sitting in his own office. In other words, she had not evicted Loretta purely out of embarrassment or anger. She had done it to protect a secret transaction she was actively helping to conceal. A recorded voice memo, recovered from Malcolm's phone, revealed something even more painful. In it, Simone was heard saying that Darius always chose his mother over everything else, and that once she gained full control of the house, he would finally be unable to walk away from their marriage. Darius listened to the recording in silence, understanding at last that Simone had never seen the mortgage as simply a loan, she had seen it as a leash. During a formal internal interview conducted with legal counsel present, Simone admitted she had agreed to use the house as collateral, though she still insisted Malcolm had assured her Darius's signature was merely a routine formality. Celeste calmly pointed out that Simone had deleted 6 separate warning emails, advising her never to use a signature without explicit consent. Faced with the evidence laid plainly in front of her, Simone finally began to break down, She confessed that she had long resented Darius's quiet, modest way of living, despite his obvious financial ability to do far more. She believed he was deliberately holding her back, denying her the kind of life she felt she deserved. Darius revealed something she had never known, that his personal wealth could have paid off the mortgage many times over without any difficulty at all. He had kept the loan active only because Simone wanted to build her own credit history and prove her financial independence on her own terms. He had given her exactly the independence she had demanded, and she had used that same independence to deceive him. Loretta agreed to meet Simone privately, without Darius present. Simone attempted an apology, though it initially focused more on the consequences she was now facing than on the pain she had caused. Loretta interrupted her gently, but firmly telling her she was not sorry for leaving an old woman standing in the rain. She was only sorry the rain had finally reached her too. Loretta made clear she would not push Darius toward revenge, but she would not push him toward forgiveness either. She then placed the old house key on the table between them and told Simone she no longer needed to return to a place where kindness had to be forced out of someone by consequence. Days later, the bank issued a formal notice, explaining that because the collateral had been fraudulently misrepresented, Simone had 7 days to make a decision. She could either provide $1,300,000 in legitimate additional collateral and sell the house entirely to settle the connected loan, or face formal default proceedings under the terms of her original contract. Simone had no way to provide additional collateral since her accounts had already been frozen as part of the ongoing investigation into Ashbourne Properties. She was left with no choice but to put the mansion up for sale. Word spread quickly through the industry she had once dominated, and colleagues who had admired her for years now kept their distance without explanation. Several former coworkers quietly revealed that Malcolm had never intended to promote her at all. He had simply needed someone with strong credit and access to a wealthy husband's assets. Simone realized far too late that she had traded away her family for a promise that had never truly existed in the first place. People who had once fought for a seat beside her at industry dinners now sent brief, careful messages, wishing her well from a distance, the kind of message meant to close a door quietly rather than slam it. She had spent years building a name inside that industry, and she watched it unravel in the space of a single news cycle, faster than she had ever imagined a reputation could fall. Because Darius had originally contributed the down payment on the house, his attorneys informed him he had legal grounds to pursue a share of its value. He chose not to fight for any profit at all. Instead, he asked only to be repaid the exact amount he had originally contributed without interest, allowing Simone to keep whatever remained after the bank's obligations were settled. When Celeste asked why he was being so generous under the circumstances, Darius answered simply that justice did not need to become cruelty in order to prove it had power. Still, he filed for divorce and requested a complete separation of their remaining finances, unwilling to leave any part of his future entangled with hers again. A middle-aged couple eventually purchased the mansion for less than Simone had once expected, though enough to cover the primary mortgage and most of the fraudulent collateral obligation. Simone packed her own belongings alone, room by room, with no assistant and no admiring audience left to witness the process. Beneath a chair in the guest room, she found Loretta's forgotten slippers, still resting exactly where they had been left the night she was thrown out into the rain. That small discovery broke something in Simone that money status and public humiliation never had. She packed the slippers along with the abandoned photo album into a single box, and for the first time, she cried over something that had nothing to do with her own reputation. Malcolm attempted to cooperate with prosecutors by claiming Simone had been the true architect behind the entire scheme. Simone faced a choice between continuing to protect her own image through further denial or handing over every piece of evidence that proved Malcolm had orchestrated the fraud from the very beginning. She ultimately chose to cooperate, fully surrendering access to a hidden data archive Malcolm believed no one else could reach. This decision did not erase her own responsibility, but it helped prevent dozens of investors from losing everything and protected several homeowners from similarly fraudulent mortgage schemes. The day before the house sale was finalized, Simone sent Darius a sealed envelope. Inside was not a plea for forgiveness. It was a complete written confession, in which she took full responsibility for every choice she had made without blaming Malcolm Darius or Loretta for a single one of them. Malcolm was formally charged with bank fraud, forging digital signatures, illegal fund transfers, conspiracy to conceal assets, and defrauding investors. Simone avoided the most severe charges by cooperating fully with prosecutors, though she still accepted full responsibility for submitting falsified documents and misusing a signature that was never hers to use. She agreed to pay significant financial penalties, complete an extended term of community service, and accept a formal restriction, preventing her from holding any financial management position for a set number of years. She agreed to testify against Malcolm in his upcoming trial and to withdraw any claim against Darius's personal assets as part of their divorce settlement. Each condition she accepted chipped away at the version of herself she had spent years building, but she signed every document without argument. Darius refused to treat Meridian Crown Bank as a personal trophy, choosing instead to use his new authority to reform it from the ground up. He established a dedicated division to protect elderly borrowers from predatory lending practices, and he required direct in-person verification for any mortgage involving multiple property owners. He banned employees from approving collateral addendums based solely on unverified digital signatures, kept the majority of frontline staff employed through the transition, and created a legal aid fund for customers affected by property fraud. When the bank publicly announced its new elder protection program, Loretta was invited to speak not to shame Simone, but to speak plainly about what she had endured. She told the room that a single locked door could cost one person their home, but silence throughout an entire system could cost countless people their hope. She spoke about how easily an older person could be dismissed, overlooked, or quietly pushed aside by people who assumed age made them invisible. And she asked the bankers in the room to remember that every account number belonged to a full and complicated life. When she finished, the applause lasted longer than anyone in the room expected, and Darius watched from the back, understanding that his mother's voice was doing more good than any amount of capital he could have injected into the bank alone. At the final mediation session, Simone arrived without an expensive attorney or the polished image she once wore like armor, and she signed the divorce papers without a single objection. She told Darius she understood now that he had never bought the bank purely for revenge. He admitted that at first some part of him had wanted her to feel exactly as powerless as his mother once had. But he had come to understand that power was worthless if it only turned a person into a wealthier version of whoever had hurt them first. When Simone asked whether he might one day forgive her, Darius said honestly that he did not know. He explained that forgiveness did not require reconciliation, that regret did not erase consequence, and that love could not survive without safety, no matter how sincerely someone eventually apologized. After the mediation ended, Loretta received the keys to a brand new home. On the deed, only one name appeared: Loretta Whitmore. Darius purchased a modest, single-story home with a small garden for his mother near old friends she had known for decades. He refused to call it a gift, insisting instead that it was simply repayment for everything she had sacrificed to help him build his future. Loretta agreed to accept the house only on the condition that Darius would not hire staff to manage every detail of her daily life. She wanted to remain independent, capable, and in control of her own days, exactly as she had always been. On moving day, Darius handed her a full set of keys, and she looked at the small pile in her palm before smiling and telling him she only needed one. Darius told her the rest were for anyone she chose to trust and that no one would ever again have the power to lock her outside her own life. Loretta held onto that single key, a little tighter, understanding exactly what her son meant by it. It was not simply about a house anymore. It was about the right to decide for herself who was allowed close and who was not. Months later, Simone was living in a small apartment and working an administrative role at a nonprofit organization that assisted victims of real estate fraud. She was not portrayed as someone fully redeemed, since she still carried the weight of every choice she had made and lived under the watchful, uncertain eyes of people who remembered exactly who she used to be. Slowly, though, she began proving change through action rather than words. Her new coworkers knew her only as a quiet woman who worked hard and rarely spoke about her past, and there were mornings she sat across from a frightened elderly client fighting to keep a home and saw with an ache she could not explain. Away the same fear that had once stood barefoot on a porch, the rain. She returned Loretta's forgotten slippers, the family photo album, a handwritten letter, and a check meant to repay the money Loretta had once given the young couple during their hardest years together. Loretta refused the check outright, instead asking Simone to use that same money to help another elderly person at risk of losing their home. Simone followed through without hesitation and mailed Loretta the receipt afterward, without attaching any plea for sympathy or forgiveness. It was the first moment Loretta genuinely believed that whatever remorse Simone carried might actually be real. Malcolm was eventually sentenced to prison after evidence confirmed he had caused tens of millions of dollars in damage across multiple fraudulent schemes. Ashbourne Properties was forced into restructuring and required to compensate the investors it had failed to protect. Simone never reclaimed her former career, but her testimony helped several families keep the homes they had nearly lost because of decisions made far above their understanding. 1 year after the acquisition, Meridian Crown Bank announced it had returned to profitability without closing a single branch or laying off its frontline employees. At the celebration, Wendell asked Darius what made him proudest: the acquisition itself, the downfall of Malcolm Vance, or the hundreds of jobs that had ultimately been saved. Darius watched his mother speaking warmly with several bank employees across the room before answering. He said that the night he found her standing in the rain, he believed he needed to buy something powerful enough that no one could ever hurt her again. It took him time to understand that what she truly needed was never a bank at all. It was simply someone willing to open a door. Simone attended the celebration only because Loretta had personally invited her, not Darius, and she kept her distance rather than inserting herself into a family she no longer belonged to. Before leaving, she approached Darius briefly and told him she once believed owning a house meant having the right to decide who deserved to be inside it. She said she finally understood that a house only held real value when the people living inside it felt safe. Darius made no promise of reconciliation. He simply told her to keep living as though she truly understood that lesson, and Simone nodded quietly before walking away for good. That night, Darius drove his mother home to the house that finally belonged only to her. Before he left, she checked the front door, then deliberately chose to leave it unlocked. When Darius asked if she had simply forgotten, Loretta shook her head and told him she wanted to remember that the door was hers, to control that she could lock it whenever she needed to, but she would never again use it to make another human being feel like they no longer counted as one. Darius kissed his mother's forehead and stepped out onto the porch, remembering the night 1 year earlier when he had found her standing outside a locked door in the pouring rain at midnight. Now she stood safely inside a home of her own, warm light glowing behind her keys, resting securely in her hand. He thought of every version of that night he might have chosen. Instead, every version where anger alone had driven his decisions, and he was grateful in the end that he had chosen something steadier than revenge. Darius had bought the bank holding Simone's mortgage, but the true victory was never about controlling a loan, a mansion, or anyone's financial future. It was about using power without becoming cruel, and making certain his mother would never again have to beg to walk through a door that was rightfully hers. As he drove away from her small lit house that night, he understood that some debts could never be repaid in dollars, only in the steady, quiet act of showing up again and again until trust finally felt safe enough to rest.